Yes, hello. This is Orthotomeo. Straight talk about the biblical text. I am S.W. Kibler, your guide into the biblical text where truth lives. Now remember, when studying the biblical text, there is no denominational influence that comes into the interpretation. The biblical text must stand on its own. I say this because, again, this weekend I was listening to a fairly popular TV teacher preacher who is accurate in his preaching per the denomination that he represents, but the biblical text was not represented as accurately as it should have been. So, I've mentioned this before. You will hear and see things on these broadcasts of Orthotomeo that you probably have not heard before, and it may cause a faith shake. That is, a crisis of faith. But you are to study to show yourself approved unto God. A workman does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. One of my children asked me why they had not heard a lot of these teachings that I'm teaching now. You know, when they were younger children and still at home, why they didn't hear these things. And not only here, but also on the other YouTube channel that I have. It's called The Cosmic Bible, God's Word for Today and Beyond. So the truth, the answer to that question is, I used to be one of those preachers, teachers that taught what was prescribed, recommended, fell into the status quo of a particular denomination. Then I began to study the biblical text itself, allowing the biblical text to interpret itself. And I found out I, myself, had skipped over some controversial passages of scriptures, and I had not taught what it actually said. What I had taught instead was what I had been told was the true interpretation. So, Orthotomeo is straight talk about the biblical text. You decide what you are going to believe, but study to ensure what you believe contains all the information. So, let's get right back to the biblical text, and we are in Genesis chapter 1, and so we'll start reading from verse 1. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Now, in the previous video, we looked at the timing of the beginning. The timing of the beginning, as I mentioned to me, is moot, because time as we know it did not exist before there was time. Time is limited to space, that is the physical dimensions, right? Height, length, width. Time is a measurement of distance. On Earth, time is measured. It's a measurement of the distance of travel of this planet in its orbit around the sun, along with the measurements of its own revolution. So by the same standard, time is different on other planets in the solar system, since they all revolve at different speeds and orbit the sun at different rates. So one must ask if time even exists elsewhere. Does time exist outside this solar system? Does time, as we know it, exist outside of the physical realm of this earth? And if it does, how would it be measured? Mentioned last time also that even research has shown that the speed of light has not remained constant. So what would you use for a measurement? Well, we have to use what we have. Right? But one of the things we want to remember is that God is not confined to this physical domain as we are. In 2 Peter 3:8, we read, "But do not overlook this one fact, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." So, that's why I believe that time is a very relative thing, and we make it very important when I think in the scheme of all things, we don't understand time. Right? So we're going to continue looking at time, this theme of time. And when we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 through 5, it tells us, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." This is the beginning of time. Time on earth, as we know it. Remember that God is not bound by these laws and the physics that we are. The Creator, God, is outside those dimensions of length, height, width, and time. Eternity is the absence of time. No beginning and no ending. So God is eternal. He lives in eternity, and that means there is no time. And we kind of talked about that last video as well. That forever, we see there's a beginning and then it continues on. But with eternity, there's no beginning or ending. There's no time. But even as we reckon time here on earth, the laws of physics show us that time is not consistent due to gravity, elevation, and velocity. So what we have here is a reckoning of the atomic, right? The atomic clocks. There are two that are located here on this planet. One at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder, Colorado, and the other is in Greenwich, England. Both clocks are accurate to 1 second per 1 million years. Okay? The two atomic clocks, one in Greenwich, England, one in Boulder, Colorado. Both of the atomic clocks are accurate to 1 second per million years. The clock at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that atomic clock tracks 5 nanoseconds faster per year than the atomic clock in Greenwich, England. Okay? So the one in Boulder, Colorado tracks not a lot, but measurable nanoseconds faster, 5 nanoseconds faster per year than the atomic clock in Greenwich. So which clock is correct? If they don't show the same time at the end of the year, which clock is correct? The reality is they both are. The difference is the elevation at which the clocks are set, right, where they are located. Where Boulder is about 5,500 feet above sea level, Greenwich is only 80. So there's a difference of 10 to the minus 16 per meter of elevation. And that's what we see. So even the atomic clock, when it's measuring time, there's a difference in time between here and elevation in Boulder and there in Greenwich, England. But both clocks are as accurate as the other. It's just an example to see that we look at time, and time is not always constant where you are. We see that there are things that affect time. That time actually is a physical characteristic. Then that's what Albert Einstein came to the conclusion with his theory of relativity, is that we live in a space-time continuum. That height, length, width, and time are physical components of the experience that we have here in this life. So we were talking about the speed of light, and even it's really difficult to measure other than using mathematics. And then the reality that they have determined that the time speed of light has not remained constant, that it has varied. So even with travel into space, the universe outside the solar system. So if we had two astronauts, and they were twins and they were born at the same time, right? And we're going to keep one here on Earth, and the other we're going to send to the nearest star, which is Alpha Centauri. Okay, and so they're both the same age. One stays here on Earth, and the other gets in the spacecraft and travels at near the speed of light. Let's say 99% of the speed of light to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri. Okay, so what happens is the one traveling at close to the speed of light, on Earth, we see that Alpha Centauri is 4.5 light years away. That is 4.5 years at the speed of light. So to go to Alpha Centauri and back would take, we would assume, 9 years. Well, and that's true. On Earth, the astronaut the twin who stayed on Earth, would be here and wait 9 years for his twin brother to get back. However, the traveling astronaut, because of the difference in time due to velocity, elevation, and mathematics, traveling at near the speed of light, the astronaut that takes this trip will only experience a trip taking 33 days. So on Earth, it'll be 9 years worth of time. But for the one traveling, it will only take 33 days. So theoretically, the astronaut that stayed on Earth will have aged nearly 9 years, while the twin brother in the spacecraft traveling at the speed of light would have only aged 33 days. So, when we talk about time, we need to know that where that measurement is taking place, at what elevation and at what velocity, and what is the mass of the object, because gravity affects time as well. If it's here on Earth, then it's relatively constant within nanoseconds. But the biblical text tells us about time is the Creator God created the time measurements according to the dimensions of this created reality, based on the physical characteristics of this part of creation. So let's think about a couple of New Testament. Oh, and here's the slide for the Alpha Centauri trip. That there's a mathematical formula that shows that the astronaut that's traveling will only experience 33 days, and the one on Earth will experience 9 years. So I think I had borrowed this slide from a presentation that Chuck Missler done. So I'm giving him credit for that. Chuck Missler is a very intellectual Christian, and he was an expositor, and he died just a couple of years ago. But I want to give him credit for presenting this, and I borrowed this one slide, so I hope that's okay with his family, because it's absolutely astounding when we start thinking about time and creation. So let's think of a couple of New Testament sections of the biblical text and the idea of time. Okay? In Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5, we read, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." So in the fullness of time. Okay. And in Romans 5, verse 6, Romans chapter 5, verse 6, it says, "While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." At the right time. So we have the fullness of time and at the right time. But It's not limited to how we account for time. God has his own accounting of time. At God's right time, in the fullness of God's time, when he determined it to be right, he sent forth his son. It doesn't have to be accounted to our days and our years, but in God, whatever his experience is, it was right on earth for him to act in the way that he did. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, and at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly to bring about salvation. God has his own accounting of time measured according to him and his agenda that is outside the time of this earth. Right? So just something to consider, that God does what he does when he wants to do it. And it's not necessarily a reckoning of our earth and the time as we experience here. So now back to Genesis. When the Creator God called a day, that is exactly what it was, right? And it was determined by the rotation of the earth with a light source, right? A light source directed on the planet. The biblical text deems an evening and a morning. The darkness and the light had been brought into association with the rotation of the earth, and that was deemed one day, morning, evening, the first day. But that was day one on earth, not day one for anything else, right? And so that's as accurate as we can attribute time was when that light source was created. And as we mentioned before, there were no other planets. There wasn't the sun to give off light. It was a light source created by God. But the earth evidently was rotating, and that rotation of the earth on its axis, and with a light source directed towards it, became evening and morning, day one, and that's exactly the way it's reckoned. And that's important for us to understand. God is being very specific here. There was evening, there was morning, there was the first day. Now, there's always a lot of controversy over the 6 days of creation, right? And we will get into that a little bit. But it's important to just look at the biblical text. And we talked about eisegesis last time, and that's reading into the text saying a day isn't a day, or the day is an extended period of time. Well, A, with God, there is no time. B, with the time reckoning on earth, the Creator gave us that reckoning. It's an evening and a morning is the first day. Now, unless the earth was rotating on its axis at a very, very slow rate, and it took millions of years for it to rotate from evening to morning, right? But that's not what the text says. So day one, the first day, was a morning, evening, it's a day. In this reality that we have, these dimensions of length, height, width, and then the time as it interacts with those other physical realities. So, I've intentionally proposed that day one is attributed to the light source, which is what the biblical text indicates. Before there was light, there was no time, or rather a mechanism to measure or account for time here on earth. So, let's go back to the biblical text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light, it was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, he called the darkness night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Now, I had mentioned in the previous video that there was not evidence or grammatical ability to insert a gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. However, the grammatical construction of the first two verses and the third verse does give ability for a gap. Not a gap that includes pre-Adamic or living beings inhabiting the earth, but a possible period of unknown length between when the earth was formed and was formless and void, uninhabited, and then when the light source was created, right? So when the darkness was over the deep, the Spirit of God hovered over the deep, before there was a light source. We don't know what measurement there is between verses Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and verse 3, when the light was created. But what we do know is that when light was created, then we have an accounting of time. Now there's a mechanism. It's the darkness and the light. Okay, I hope you're tracking here. So, probably a better way to look at these is how the text itself is constructed. And I'm going to use a Jewish Publication Society translation of the Hebrew text. And so I'm going to read it from that. So it's, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. Okay, so that's one complete thought. It's one sentence containing three clauses. Right? Then we read a second sentence, verse 3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. It seems that the intent of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 are to get us to verse 3. So there's a point that the earth was unformed, right, and uninhabited, but the Spirit of God was present, but maybe not actively doing anything with the planet Earth. God was there in the person of the Holy Spirit, but the earth was still unformed and uninhabited. And at some point, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was unformed. The heavens were incomplete. That is, the heavens where the other planets and the stars are hung in the sky, right? It doesn't tell us when, but it tells us the original condition of the earth. It was unformed and empty, and it didn't become that way. It was originally that way. After some period of unmeasurable time, then God began to act upon the earth. His first act of the 6 days of creation, it seems that the text indicates, is in verse 3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And we know that, as we mentioned, the solar system, as we know it, wasn't originally in place until another several verses down on the fourth day in Genesis 1:14. But when God said in Genesis 1:14, he said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven, and separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw it was good. And there was evening, there was morning, the fourth day. So I think one of the things that's important to understand is there was something before there was what we know of earth. That which we can see, we can feel, we can handle, this physical experience. And we talked about other dimensions, and if there are other dimensions, and it's proposed by superstring theory, right, that there's 10 dimensions. The 4 that we're familiar with is height, length, width, and time. That's how we know it. That's how we exist. But before there was light, was there time? Probably not as we know it, right? So, time as we know it didn't exist, right? But what we do know is the time that we can reckon is when God began his work, the first of the 6 days, right? He created light. And that's the continued work of Yahweh, the Lord, in regards to the earth and the environment of the cosmos. Okay, so there was God, and there was heaven, not the universe as we know it, but where the Lord resides. And it seems logical then that this heaven is not the heaven we see at night, the stars, the moon, and so forth. But there were creative acts of God before day one of the creation, right, that he administered upon an unformed earth. And before he set the sun and the moon and the stars in the solar system and the universe, because in the beginning was God, and then there was the unformed, the formless earth, and it was uninhabited. So we think we have to account for everything in creation by using our human mind. Can we accept that God has done things that don't revolve around us? Is it possible that he has done things that we are not the center of? Right? What we do is we try to make ourselves the center of everything, when in reality, God is the center of all things. This is what we read in Colossians, chapter 1, verses 16 through 17. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. There are things God created that are invisible to our eyes. That is, they exist in at least one other dimension. Are we to assume that God existed in a void, in a vacuum, in the dark, him alone, just floating around and nothing? It says he created thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities. These are not physical things. These are entities, beings with power and responsibility in certain realms or locations. And we'll investigate that a little bit deeper. But what we have to realize is that God created other things that we can't see. It's not part of this creation of the earth and our solar system and the stars and the planets. That God created things that are visible, we can see them, but also invisible. Right? And so we don't know all of creation. It's postulated that of the universe, science is only aware of 5% of what there actually is. And so we try to base our understanding on possibly only 5% out of 100% of what reality actually is. Right? So that's not much, but that's what they're postulating that we know. And that's what they're trying to figure out. They're trying to figure out more than 5% of what actually is there. So we don't know what the earth was like before the Creator God brought light onto it and caused dry ground to appear, because it was unformed. It had not yet become what it was going to become. But the Hebrew and the Greek text indicates that Creator God created other things, other entities, before he brought light onto the earth. When? We don't know. It's immeasurable. You can't measure it. It's outside of the measurements of time as we know it. But we do know that there was God before anything else. And there was where God exists. Heaven, before God began to do his work on earth. So we are forced to accept the biblical text by faith, that the creation of the earth was purposeful and executed by the one we know as Yahweh, the Lord, the Most High God. And we do know this. Our Creator has come to visit us in the form of the one we know as Yeshua, Jesus the Christ. And he came from out of time into our time at just the right time. So this is Orthotomeo, and I am Dr. S.W. Kibler, and always remember, know the truth, stand on the truth, and speak the truth. God bless you.